Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Brossman Center and of the Philadelphia campus of United Lutheran Seminary. I'm Martin Otto Zimmern, and I serve as the Senior Director of our Kindling Faith Continuing Education Program, and I am so delighted to see so many people here in the same space together. As they're calling it, in the time before, this would be no big deal. But tonight, because you are here, we are doubly blessed. And I know that Dr. Cooper-White would much rather talk to a room with people in it than to the internets out there where you can't really exchange that nuance. So it's a blessing to have all of you with us. And I want to give special thanks to our friends Hans and Siri Quitmeyer. Thank you so much this evening for making this lecture possible. And grateful for. There are many folks who contributed to this the Lazarus lecture, so we're grateful for all of the support that the seminary receives. Because of people like you, we are able to offer full tuition to all of our students. Oh, I'm supposed to say up to full tuition for all our students, but that is pretty much the case, and it is wonderful to see them blossoming without that burden of student loans. So thank you for your support. Now, the Reverend William Lazarus earned a bachelor's degree in history in 1948 from Princeton. In 1953, he earned a Master of Divinity degree from the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He earned a doctorate in doctrinal theology from Columbia University at Union Theological Seminary in 1958. And since that time, he was added, 7 honorary doctorates were added to his portfolio, to his CV. Following his ordination in 1956, he was a faculty member for nearly 20 years here at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, serving as the Hagen Professor of Systematic Theology and Dean of the Faculty. After he left here, he became a distinguished visiting professor here, and in 1976, he became director for the Department of Church and Society for the Lutheran Church in America, Division for Mission in North America. After serving 3 years as director of the World Council of Churches Faith and Order Secretariat, he became pastor of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Manhattan, where he served from 1983 to 1987. He was visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary from 87 to 96, and from 1991 to 2002, he was co-president of the Lutheran Eastern Orthodox International Doctrinal Dialogues Lutheran World Federation in Geneva. In 1988, he was elected bishop of the ELCA Metro New York Synod and served in that role until 1992, when he retired from active ministry. But as we know, people never retire from active ministry. From 1996 to 2003, he was a member of the Executive Staff Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton and was a visiting professor at Princeton University before he joined the faculty at Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 2003. He passed in 2008 at the age of 79. He authored 13 books, edited 15 books, and wrote at least 45 essays. And in 1995, he was named Lutheran Pastor of the Year, USA, by the Lutheran Institute in Washington, D.C. So we stand on the shoulders of a very particular, blessed, and brilliant giant this evening. And without any further ado, I want to introduce the introducer to our speaker, President Guy Irwin, another blessing to United Lutheran Seminary.
Thank you. Let me add my welcome to ULS to that of Dr. Otto Zimmern. A similarly detailed resume of accomplishments could be given for our speaker, but I will edit it somewhat in the interest of being able to say more general things, especially about my appreciation for her being here to give this talk. It's a really great pleasure to be able to invite and to then listen to a speaker who is so distinguished, whose work has crossed across so many fields, who has served with such distinction in so many places, institutions as different as Harvard and the Institute, the Chicago Institute for Clinical Social Work. She's taught at Columbia Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary. She's been a fellow at the Freud Museum in Vienna. I don't know anyone who's done that. That's a remarkable thing. There are actually very few people I know who have such wide-ranging knowledge and learning, and we're grateful to have Pamela Cooper-White with us tonight, especially at this important moment in our history, where she has enriched our national discourse on religion and politics with this powerful and discerning book on the psychology of Christian nationalism, which I believe is one of the gravest challenges to our understanding of ourselves in this country, both as Christians and as Americans. Through this book, Dr. Cooper-White offers us some suggestions for forward movement and for constructive dialogue, help that we very badly need. Her rich insights into the psychological roots of the obsession of equating the American political experiment with the certainties of evangelical religion will, I think, help us reach across some increasingly deep and rigid boundaries of opinion and emotion. And right now, this sign of hope is a very welcome one, at least for me, and I think very much in the spirit of the theological and ethical work of Bishop Lazarus, for whom this lecture is named. So let me simply do it. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Pamela Cooper-White back to our Philadelphia campus, where she served for 9 years as professor of pastoral theology. That, combined with the side effect of being married to a long-serving president of Gettysburg Seminary, makes her, in a sense, a relative on both sides of the family, and certainly a very great friend of United Lutheran Seminary. Welcome back, Pamela. Thank you for sharing with us tonight.
Thank you, Bishop Guy, for that warm introduction. And I'm an Episcopalian, so I can say bishop because you're still a bishop, in my view. Also interested to hear the connection of Bishop Lazarus with Union, where I currently teach and just completed a term as dean, God help me. And so I feel like I am triply connected to this evening in a special way, and also very grateful to be back at Philadelphia, where our daughter spent most of her growing up years, and we formed many, many deep friendships, and it's good to see some of you again tonight. Very special. So now, to a little more serious matters. Let us begin. On January 6th, 2021, why is that not happening now? Dawn? It was there before? Well, okay, picture what I'm about to describe. As we all know all too well by now, a violent mob attacked the U.S. Capitol in a shocking effort to stop the certification of the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Members of the crowd, many heavily armed and wearing military fatigues, broke through the inadequately guarded barricades, scaled the walls of Congress like commando fighters, and shattered doors and windows to enter the U.S. Capitol, causing deaths, injuries, and sheer terror throughout the building. They were spurred on by a rally near the White House, where former President Trump told the crowd, "We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Trump exhorted the crowd to take matters into their own hands and, quote, "stop the steal," instigating the violent insurrection. As the January 6th congressional investigation has shown us, this was knowingly well planned in advance, involving the highest levels of Trump's White House and a hand-picked circle of advisors, and it was outright war. Deep in the midst of the mob was a loose-knit band of religiously motivated individuals who subscribed to this movement called Christian nationalism. On display among the crowds during the attack on the Capitol were numerous flags and signs with "Jesus saves" in bold letters and other Christian symbols proudly displayed alongside numerous blatantly racist ones, including a noose and a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of Congress. A photo that went viral showed a group of men before a, 7, 8, 9 foot high cross, one with his forehead pressed against it in apparent fervent prayer. Insurgents, including the self-appointed QAnon shaman Jacob Chansley, prayed aloud after invading the Capitol and the Senate chamber. One group among the mob called themselves a Jericho March, Christians blowing shofars, praying to bring down the walls of government. And if you notice, the one in the upper left, one of the shofars was painted in the colors of the American flag. As someone who is very Jewish adjacent, as one of my high school friends tells me, I find this blasphemous on any number of levels. Perhaps most appalling for many people of faith was Trump's appeal for millions of Christians whose stated values of honesty, justice, humility, charitable speech, and a spirit of forbearance are the exact opposite of all the former president represents. Those not caught up in the violence on January 6th, nor the underlying beliefs that fueled it, still wonder, and I imagine that many of you wonder these questions as well. How can people, even those we consider good people, get so caught up in a web of lies? How can Christians who believe in Jesus' Abba God of love, mercy, justice, and truth participate in such a movement fueled by white supremacy, masculinism, and even far-fetched conspiracy theories, while ignoring or even condoning its inherent propensity to violence? How can people become convinced of such false, even delusional beliefs? How might it be possible to talk with people who have gone down the rabbit hole of brainwashing and irrational groupthink? Can dialogue help draw them back out? If so, how? Is it ever possible to talk sense into someone who's come to believe dangerous untruths that, if not addressed, can harm us all? When, how, and in what context might dialogue be fruitful, and when does it simply raise the other person's closely guarded defenses and reinforce polarization? Trump and his close imitators' appeal goes far beyond certain conservative policies against abortion, immigration, welfare, gender justice, and racial equity, which are congruent with the convictions of a broad swath of Christians often called evangelical. Trump tapped into a deep and broad reservoir of resentment and paranoia that has been accumulating for decades. A large pool of Christians who feel they are being persecuted and are called by God to rise up and defend themselves against their enemies. And not only must they regain equal footing with others in society, many believe, but they must dominate and be in control, and all this in the blessed name of Jesus. A common belief among Christian nationalists is that there has been a woeful decline of America's standing in the world because of the nation's growing degeneracy, and with it, the concomitant belief in an urgent call to restore the nation to its original goodness and a mandate to lead the world into godliness. Therefore, God has withdrawn his blessing, and I use that word deliberately because it is the word that is used, because supposedly like the ancient Israelites, she, America, has fallen into profligacy and a violation of God's laws. The United States was founded, according to this group, by all evangelical Christians, based, you're anticipating what I'm about to say, based on a misreading of the more complex history of the framers of the Constitution, and had God's special mandate to become a new Jerusalem in which white Christians, male, will rule over a nation whose laws are perfectly aligned with their own selective, fundamentalist reading of biblical mandates. Christian nationalist preachers in my observation, tend to leap across the Bible from the so-called Old Testament to the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, making scant reference, if at all, to the teachings of Jesus about love, healing, and justice. They jump from a highly selective reading of the Hebrew Bible that they believe supports the idea of a wrathful God, jumping directly to the second coming of Jesus in the end of days. In their interpretation of apocalyptic scripture, many, especially a wing of Christian nationalists called dominionists, see an avenging Jesus coming to wage spiritual warfare against the current decadent ways of America and the world. Those who hold such views see a growing depravity in the current age as evidence that the end of times is near, and it's their duty to bring it about. Christian nationalist preachers exhort the faithful in sermon and song to take this nation back, even by force if required. I believe we're at a pivotal moment in American democracy, in the American experiment, as it is called, and also in the very character of American Christianity. As my research for the book, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, I hope shows, the term Christian nationalism really means white nationalism. The main tenets of Christian nationalism are that God established the United States as a Christian nation, and therefore should essentially be a theonomy shaped by Christian values, as interpreted under an alliance of conservative Christian leaders and right-wing political activists, and a theocracy characterized by the headship of men over their households and white male leadership in the public sphere. Christian nationalists therefore oppose the separation of church and state, rather advocating for the display of Christian symbols in public spaces and explicitly Christian prayer in schools and civic gatherings. Now, I want to make a very important, clear distinction here that many black church Protestants also align Christian values with politics, but to gospel-grounded social and political action for change. Whereas white Christian nationalists' agenda is almost entirely opposed to what we would consider social justice and stands opposed to virtually everything taught in Christianity or Judaism about justice and compassion. Christian nationalists oppose religious pluralism and oppose generous immigration policies to keep out those rapists and drug dealers, as Trump infamously said, and to keep out Muslims and other non-Christians. They oppose abortion, many without exception, even in cases of rape or incest. They oppose expanding the rights of women and LGBTQ persons, and in a long chain of history beginning with the utterly denied genocidal founding of this nation on this continent, they oppose civil rights legislation and embrace laws that perpetuate structural and institutional racism. Anti-Semitic attacks have been on the rise ever since Trump's first term as president, as some extremists chant the Nazi slogan, "Jews will not replace us." Some Christian nationalists also believe that eco-justice and addressing climate change is moot because the apocalypse is coming and the earth will be destroyed anyway. Grim prognosticators have spun out scenarios in which the insurrection on January 6th was just the beginning of an attempt to undermine the core of democracy and forecast further attempts at a right-wing coup, exemplifying what historian Richard Hofstadter identified as a long-standing paranoid style in American politics. Some Christians, both mainline or liberal and evangelical, have begun to sound the alarm from within the church about the dangers of Christian nationalism and its corrosive effects on both the nation and on American Christianity itself. Most notably now, an organization called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And I urge you to take a look at that organization, Google it. They are doing some incredibly wonderful educational activities. There's a petition you can sign, but I think even more powerful, they're beginning to form groups in local in North Texas right now is their first pilot group for an educational program, and they're doing wonderful work to try to bring to light all of this information. Lest we conclude that Christian nationalism is a fringe movement involving only a small percentage of American Christians, bear with me as I share some statistics here. Overwhelmingly, that nearly two-thirds of mainline Protestants, these are the members of the supposedly liberal church Christian denominations, like Lutherans and Episcopalians, two-thirds of mainline Protestants and two-thirds of all Christians taken together agree with at least some of these survey statements that the success of the United States is part of God's plan, the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation, advocate Christian values, not enforce strict separation of church and state, allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces, and allow prayer in public schools. Two large-scale studies by sociologists Whitehead and Perry in 2020 and by McDaniel and his team in 2022 have provided the following statistics, some of which are surprising in size and scope. So 52% of all Americans agree with some or all Christian nationalist beliefs, Whitehead and Perry. McDaniel found a range, doing a survey of surveys, of 47 to 71%. The most recent Baylor religion study put it at 64%. And this is probably good news. Brand new study put out by the Public Religion and Research Institute, PRRI, just last month, put it at about 29% of Americans, including 84% of white evangelical Protestants. So there's some good news there that it's dropped. And according to Amanda Taylor at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, the most hardcore, what I call the true believers, many have slid over now into the supporters, but not 100% true believers. So there is some attrition there in the extreme end. 54% of Republicans account for this, and versus 15% of Democrats and 23% of independents. So Republicans have 4 times greater likelihood of being sympathetic to Christian nationalism than other voters. 88% of Christian nationalists are white evangelical Protestants, or 74%, depending on which study you look at. And among evangelical Protestants, 80 to 84% agree with Christian nationalism. And that number actually has increased from 80 to 84%. 3/4 of those Americans who disagree with Christian nationalism are non-Christians. A half are unaffiliated, and a little over a third belong to other religious traditions. And this came out from McDaniel last year, which really was stunning to me. 60% of what I call the true believers, they agree with all those statements. And 37% of soft Christian nationalists who believe some of those statements believe that non-Christians create immoral policies, versus just 11% of those who disagree. So who are the diehard true believers? Whitehead and Perry calls them the ambassadors. Over 1/2 are evangelical Protestants. This is the hardcore folks now, so don't get the statistics mixed up. They don't sound like the ones from the slide before. That's okay. The math all actually does compute. So over 1/2 are evangelical Protestants, 19% Catholics, 11% of mainline Protestants, and 10% of black Protestants, but you have to understand that's weighted by the percentage of the whole population, and so it's only about 1% of Americans overall. Slightly more than 1/2 are women, half live in the South, and 1/3 live in rural areas. Collectively, they have the lowest formal education and economic status, and on average, they are 10 years older than other groups, averaging in the mid-50s. The religious beliefs of the true believers are 94% overwhelmingly believe in God without any doubts at all and hold the Bible in high esteem. Note that this does not correlate with greater church attendance according to Whitehead and Perry. Many of them profess to be true Christians, but they didn't necessarily go to church. But more recent studies have not found that to be the case. McDaniel and the PRI study last month actually found that many of them do go to church rather regularly. 94% overwhelmingly believing in God without any doubts at all and holding the Bible in high esteem is twice those who mostly resist Christian nationalism and 7 times greater than those who reject Christian nationalism entirely. Well over 2/3 endorse a literalist interpretation of the Bible versus only about 5% of those who oppose Christian nationalism, and 85% consider the Bible the inspired word of God, twice those who oppose Christian nationalism. So you're seeing a very strong tilt on that end of the Christian nationalist spectrum toward fundamentalist understandings of Scripture. And in general, a more evangelical tilt in terms of religious practice and belief, although we have to be cognizant that many mainline church folks in the pew also endorse these ideas. So what about the soft Christian nationalists, those who are not wholly convinced of all Christian nationalist beliefs but still lean toward it? About 1/3 are evangelical Protestants and 1/3 are Catholics. This is where the conservative Catholic movement comes into play here. 13% are mainline Protestants and 9% are black Protestants. Again, weighted, that's only 0.9% of Americans overall. About 2/3 are white. Women slightly outnumber men. Over 1/3 live in the South, and this is where the Midwestern conservative movement comes into play. About 1/3 of the soft Christian nationalists live in the Midwest, mostly in towns and suburbs. Most have slightly better educational and economic advantages than the true believers, and about 3/4 believe in God without any doubts and also revere the Bible. These beliefs, I want to say something about Dobson. A vast publishing empire and online Christian family content, such as James Dobson's decades-old Focus on the Family, also promotes Christian nationalist ideas as part of its campaign to promote the traditional patriarchal family and to indoctrinate children into a melding of religion, right-wing patriotism, and a conservative, God-honoring definition of Christian family life. Right-wing Christian church services are awash in patriotic symbols and songs, and public political rallies are now awash in evangelical prayer and so-called Christian music. So if you look at these images, it's really hard to tell which is a rally and which is a church service. Michael Flynn, who you may remember was pardoned by Trump for lying to the FBI, which happens to be a felony, is now leading a national reawakening tour to recruit what he calls an army of God, blending alt-right politics, Christian rhetoric, and QAnon conspiracy theories. And at somewhere between $250 and $500 a ticket, you can even get baptized in a big metal tub. These beliefs and a movement that includes a large segment of the population will not go away, even as in the recent election there was some movement away from right-wing extremism in some parts of the country. As of fall 2022, a large percentage of Republicans, about 2/3, still believe in the myth of widespread fraud in the 2020 election, as do about 40% of all Americans. And I just had to throw up these images because they're just too stunning to ignore. Several Christian-identified law schools' curricula are explicitly designed to send out an ever-increasing cadre of graduates to strengthen the influence of conservative Christian beliefs on the practices of law, the judiciary, and the national government. A secretive Christian right legislative campaign, Project Blitz, sponsored by the Congressional Prayer Caucus and right-wing Christian groups since 2016, has published its model bills through state legislatures and has an annual playbook for dominionist legislative strategy. If you've ever wondered why in the news so many of the states seem to be passing nearly identical laws, it's because they're getting them from this organization that pushes model bills toward the conservative legislators. A recent New York Times article exposed how wealthy alt-right activists like the Wrights, the owners of Hobby Lobby, together with Christian nationalist pastors, strategically gained access and influence with Justice Alito and some Supreme Court staff. We're now seeing the fruits of this strategic infiltration at every level of government, from local school boards to state legislatures to decades-long campaigns to pack the Supreme Court with anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, conservative activist judges. And that was accomplished. Let me be clear then. Christian nationalism is a fanatical, radical departure from the teachings of Jesus and any faithful reading of either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, and it is dangerously anti-democratic. My research has also focused on the psychology of the movement. Why and how do people get hooked on Christian nationalism and related conspiracy theories? I utilize both sociological and psychoanalytic lenses to explore the psychology behind people's vulnerability to being captivated by false teachings, both religious and political, and their personal investment in maintaining these beliefs. First, from a more sociological perspective, I identify at least 4 conscious motivations behind adherence to Christian nationalist ideas. First, the need to belong. Evangelization fulfills the need for belonging and a sense of purpose, heightened by the religious appeal to join in a cosmic battle of good and evil, with tactics that are similar and at times nearly identical with cult recruiting. I go into more detail on this in the book, but for now I'll just leave it at that. Secondly, the fear of loss of white social status, resentment against a perceived, though still quite minimal statistically, loss of jobs and economic power to immigrants and people of color, and a desire to maintain or regain white supremacy and white power in the face of the reality that, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the year 2042 will mark the end of a white majority population in the United States. Now, for many of us, that might be a moment to celebrate the increasing diversity of our nation, but for these folks, it is experienced as an existential threat. Thirdly, a fear of loss of patriarchal authority and a masculinist hierarchy both in the home and in the public sphere of work and governmental power, which is also related to an infatuation with guns that far exceeds any need for hunting or personal protection. I'll come back to that in a moment. And finally, the irrational allure of conspiracy theories such as QAnon, whose beliefs are now adopted by as many as 1 in 5 Americans overall and 1/4 of evangelical Christians. If you look at this image, if it's not immediately apparent to you, this placard exactly shows the merger of QAnon conspiracy theories with Christian identity. God wins, heart, heart. And where we go one, we go all is a motto of QAnon. These 4 motivations are made explicit by people to varying degrees, but they are conscious to the extent that adherents of Christian nationalism would agree to them, even if using different language to describe them. Turning toward unconscious motivations, these involve the insidious subliminal pulls from unconscious group dynamics, going back to Sigmund Freud's prescient analysis of groups in 1921, and parallels between Christian nationalism and the power of cult-like groups and their narcissistic leaders to make and amplify false claims, including the role of both mainstream and social media. The power of group persuasion was long known by psychologists throughout history. I believe Freud's 1921 group psychology is as relevant a description today as it was in his own time regarding the psychologically symbiotic bond between followers and their idealized leaders. Freud's breakthrough in 1921, right on the heels of World War I, was to recognize the power of a narcissistic leader and the ways in which the followers unconsciously hand over their individual consciences to a demagogue who, with simplistic moral directives and all good versus evil political rhetoric, promises to restore whatever they perceive is lacking in their lives. Such leaders exude a fusion of power and erotic potency that men can merge with at an unconscious psychic level, and women can admire, even desire. How relevant is this to the rise of right-wing strongmen leaders like Trump and the bloody dictators across the globe that he still emulates and praises, as in his praise for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which was amplified by a shocking number of Christian evangelicals. And this also ties in with the symbolic value of guns and a defensive hyper-masculinity and the extraordinary prevalence of guns in the United States, a preoccupation that is shared by a majority of white evangelical Christians who own the most guns among any religious group in the U.S. and who fuse the Second Amendment right to bear arms with a skewed religious fervor for political freedom. As the Outback restaurant motto has it, no rules, just rights. And yes, oops, where's Sarah? And yes, beginning with Sarah Palin's appearance on the national political scene, women have also begun to emulate this muscular, masculine style. You may have noticed I left in some images from when I spoke at the Democratic Committee in Gettysburg, because you will all recognize Doug Mastriano, who was wearing a tie with God, all things are possible. He is sort of the nth degree of Christian nationalist beliefs and practices. Love, said Freud, puts a check on narcissism. And as such, it's crucial to civilization. But the narcissistic leader loves only himself and exploits the love and devotion of his followers only and always for his own benefit as he sees it, according to his whims. A high-conformity group with a highly manipulative leader can exploit individuals who feel wounded, whether by repressed childhood traumas or by envy, economic fears, and group resentments, or by a changing societal landscape that threatens one's cherished notions of tradition and even identity. Narcissistic leaders thrive on amplifying perceived threats and providing simplistic solutions. Appeals to nostalgia for a better, earlier time, usually fictional or benefiting only one ethnic group, can be wrapped in nationalism and patriotism rather than pure ethnocentrism. So Trump's motto, "Make America Great Again," and Doug Mastriano's appeal to, quote, "restore Pennsylvania to the shining beacon of freedom and hope it once was," end quote, made this strong appeal to a glorious past that never was so glorious for scores of women, persons of color, and Native Americans who basically, it's a fiction that these folks want to believe in order to puff up their own sense of safety and identity. And the narcissistic leader can heighten this appeal by framing it all in terms of a religious cause. Mastriano's appeal, his motto, "Walk as free people," was a distorted quote attributed to the Gospel of John. Such religious appeals invoke a battle of good versus evil in which fear is all too easily mobilized into hate. So take a breath. Taking all this into consideration, how can we talk across the extreme religious and political divide that has emerged from these trends in right-wing white Christian nationalism? Is it even possible to talk, and if so, how? And if not, what to do instead? The purpose of this part of my book, as in the subtitle, is by no means to create a false peace forged by mainstream appeals to unity, which gloss over the deadly realities of racism and other forms of oppression and can silence movements for justice and social change. So not, as the Hebrew prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel both warned, crying peace, peace, where there is no peace. The powers of backlash of white supremacy and patriarchy depend on lies to keep unjust systems in place. So this goes to the heart of the question, how can I talk across the rift that's happened in my family, my church, my community, because we've come to believe in diametrically opposing ideas about faith, health, the economy, climate change, and politics? After spending some time immersed in Christian nationalist settings for my research, I came to agree, kind of reluctantly, with the assessment of many that Christian nationalists truly live in an alternate reality. Is honest, open conversation even possible? Well, several psychologists who've studied this phenomenon have stated that once people have gone down the rabbit hole of misinformation and conspiracy theories, there can be no convincing them of the truth. I disagree. As a therapist, I believe in talk, but under the right conditions. Rather than throwing in the towel, I recommend a triage approach to discern if and when fruitful conversation might be possible and when it should not be attempted. As psychologist Bandy Lee has recommended, when dialogue is not possible, engagement in education and activism are the best ways to channel our own frustration and outrage. When it comes to a firmly entrenched Christian nationalist, we have to remember that we are trying to talk not only to an individual, but to their favorite news network, an ever self-reinforcing bubble of opinion fed to them on social media through algorithms, sifting through their clicks and likes, and the hundreds or even thousands of members of their church, where they just praised Jesus and asked him to save the United States while listening to heart-thumping rock music and indoctrinating sermons. We're trying to talk to QAnon. So take a picture of this slide. Argumentation will not work, period. We do need to walk away whenever we perceive that to continue in a one-sided dialogue will either violate our own sense of personal integrity, continuing to engage with what we consider to be hate speech, or causing harm to ourselves because we're being subjected to verbal violence. When fruitful conversation may be possible, how do we put a toe in the water? And I always say, first we have to ask ourselves, am I the right person to be having this conversation? Is this the right time, and is it the right place to be having this conversation? Context matters. So there might be a yellow light, proceed with caution, when we sense some openness, as in the case of a soft Christian nationalist who's not wholly convinced by right-wing rhetoric, and where mutual liking and trust are perhaps already established. For example, with a coworker, a neighbor, a skeptical family member, or a friendly acquaintance. The only way into such a conversation is to show respect and to listen. Not to pounce on an error in their thinking or immediately try to enlighten or heal them. Who would appreciate that? But to try to understand with as much empathy as we can muster what it must be like to be this person and to inhabit their life with its various challenges and stresses. Now, empathy is not the same thing as sympathy. It's being able to step into the other person's shoes to some meaningful degree to understand where they're coming from. But it does not need to mean agreement. A green light is still always tentative when it appears that there is some real openness to re-examine convictions, but remember it can turn yellow or even red at a moment's notice. I've outlined in this third chapter a number of recommendations on how to engage in such conversation from my experience as a psychotherapist and a teacher of pastoral care. One of my former students is sitting right here and recognized a lot of these recommendations. Much of what I advocate is being non-directive, making I statements rather than universal truth claims, prefacing things by saying, well, from my point of view, or I have come to believe that, instead of all Republicans are wrong, even if they are. I know some nice Republicans. Much of what I advocate, then, is following longtime anti-racist feminist activist Loretta Ross, assuming goodwill until proven otherwise, and when confronting, engaging in a process she calls calling in, rather than publicly and self-righteously calling out the person who has said or done something that we find offensive. She reserves calling out for addressing larger systems. She calls that calling up the abuses of institutions and structures of power, and sometimes calling out, in the way we understand it, when several attempts at calling in have not helped change the behavior. Being willing, then, to listen and speak about the whole truth of what is happening in America today is finally a form of combating psychological splitting. Recognizing and resisting the very human, unconscious temptation to split everything into a Manichaean cosmic battle of good versus evil, which is what conspiracy theorists thrive on. This requires stamina. It takes courage to consciously weigh both the good and the bad of a relationship and hold them together, regarding them with both mercy and justice. Violence, whether physical or verbal, is never acceptable. But I want to believe that dialogue always has at least the potential to be constructive. Finally, one thing honest dialogue requires is to do our own inner work of healing the split between our own desired purity and the mostly disavowed evil within ourselves, to withdraw our worst projections that we have placed on another person, demonizing them, before we can enter into genuine dialogue. This is tricky, because Christian nationalism, white supremacy, misogyny, and homophobia are truly reprehensible. And that's not merely our fantasy or neurotic projection. But if we can hold the badness of a conversation partner's beliefs together with the belief in the potential for basic human goodness, as we are made in the image and likeness of God, and rationality, as Freud said, where id was, ego might be, then we not only may have the chance to exercise the skill of empathic listening, we may also finally be heard. Thank you very much.
Dr. Cooper-White, I hope you would not mind taking a few questions from our audience. And I'm glad you found the bottle of water.
Yeah, I was looking for it earlier. Thank you. So yes, I would love to hear comments, questions, reflections. I can't roam. I would love to roam, but I'm tethered by this, so. Yes?
I have a question.
Talk to the mic, please.
Oh, yes, there's a mic for comments and questions.
To what extent do you believe that economics play a role in the evangelical Christian movement, the white Christian nationalism? And I ask because in the 1980s I covered the decline of manufacturing in this country and the wreckage left behind in blue-collar communities, and we've really never dealt with that problem. And at least at first glance, a lot of these folks appear to be unemployed blue-collar workers.
Yeah, that kind of goes with the second of the conscious motivations that I referred to about the loss of social power and status, and for many, the fear of loss of employment, the shifting landscape of employment from traditional factory and agricultural workers to a service economy and a tech economy definitely is fed into a part of this feeling like things just aren't the way they used to be in the so-called good old days. And I will also venture to say that I think Democrats have, in fact, fed into somewhat of a myth, somewhat of a perception that the Democratic leadership has become elites and doesn't understand and doesn't align themselves as robustly with unions and with union movements and organizing and grassroots folks. So I think there's truth to that. I think when Hillary Clinton called the Trump supporters deplorables, she lost a lot of support from folks who felt that she just confirmed the fact that they felt contempt for them. But we have to also remember that not all of the Christian nationalists are in that group, even if they may agree with some of the resentment about losing a certain sense of traditional America. But when I went to a biker rally, for example, for Doug Mastriano, there was a lot of very expensive chrome in that parking lot. So it's not just people who are struggling in the working class. Yes, Natalia.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you would like to speak from your perspective about two seemingly paradoxical trends, one being exactly the one you presented so eloquently, Christian nationalism on one hand, with extraordinary percentages of people who embrace it hardcore or softer in a softer way on one hand, and on the other hand, the nuns and the duns, which are also a very large percentage. So, and there might be some overlap. So I was wondering if you have a sense of how to put that together, or
sure.
if at all.
If you look at any of the studies, the Pew studies, PEW, are the ones that track religious affiliation most frequently and closely. And the last Pew report showed that for the first time, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the people who no longer consider them affiliated with any religious tradition, have exceeded, they're growing at a rate faster than any other group. However, at this point, evangelical Christians are still the highest proportion of Americans. They're slightly declining, but they're still above all other groups in America. So there's that statistical reality. And they are terrified by the nuns, by the growth of the nuns. Mainline churches in the last Pew study actually went up a skosh. And we're not sure why, or if that was just a blip, but it does seem that some of the duns are finding their way back to liberal Protestant Christianity and Catholicism. And Catholicism has basically held steady in that study. What we're also seeing, though, is a decline. If you break it up by age, we're seeing that just like Christian nationalists tend to be in their 50s or older for the largest proportion, the churches also are aging across all the different Christian churches in the United States, and they're losing younger adults and teens. But what's making up for that, sort of paradoxically because of the racial fears, is that what's making up for that is an influx of Latinx and some Asian folks who bring conservative ideologies and theologies with them. And so these can look like they're level on the statistical chart, but actually they're older immigrants, conservative immigrants, are replacing younger American-born American young adults. So the landscape is definitely changing, and it is scaring conservative Christians to death. Yes?
Perhaps reinforcing your last point, Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post this morning asserts that evangelical Christians are the Christian group that's losing membership the most rapidly. I don't remember what her basis for making that claim was, but she did agree totally with your point that it's partly their assertiveness, their hysteria, is partly driven by fear of loss of influence. I'm curious how you might see the fact that the Christian right seems to dominate public discourse. When Christianity is presented in the media, it's hardly ever somebody like you. You know, it's always some rabidly right-wing version of Christianity. And I think that's partly why so many people are drifting young people are rejecting Christianity. But where's the opportunity? Why aren't Reinhold Niebuhr's sermons printed in the New York Times anymore? You know, what happened to progressive Christianity as a voice in our public life, and how can we get it back?
Well, this is the cry of all of us who are involved in this studying this work. I mean, social media and the rapidity with which sensational claims can run like a wildfire across social media, and also don't forget that there are websites that you don't even know about that are much more conservative than the ones that you do know about. So people live in that bubble, but there's also just the reality that by our nature, people who tend toward the liberal or progressive side of politics also tend toward an appreciation for ambiguity and complexity, and we just have not mastered the soundbite because we don't want to boil things down into simplistic things. So we need to, Connor, you can help us with this maybe. We need to figure out ways to work with the media and to get ourselves out there in ways that can be accessible but present a different message. I mean, we've had people like Jim Wallace and Sojourners and Ron Sider, who are evangelical social justice advocates out there for a long time, and they tend to be read by like-minded people. But how do we penetrate those other communities where they're not heard? That is one of the things Christians Against Christian Nationalism is trying to do, and they're trying to work with churches in communities that are heavily conservative. So they're starting in North Texas with their first pilot project to actually bring together groups of people to talk to each other and to try to seed opposition to Christian nationalism into mainline church life. But you're right, we're up against a struggle there. The other thing about Catholics losing evangelical Protestant churches losing membership, statistically they're losing members, individual members, but they're still gaining members. The Southern Baptist Convention, for example, is still gaining churches who sign on with the SBC because it allows independent churches to have things like insurance policies for their ministers and an institutional denominational identity. So they're losing individual members, but they're also gaining churches. So it's a little bit of a complex picture there. Yes?
So first, thank you very much for your time. I have a comment and a question. I think reflection on the last discussion you just had, I think something to think about is mainline white church culture as we behave in the pews is how we behave in the public discourse. And I think that's reflective. That's a challenge that we have. And it may not be possible to overcome that.
You mean the frozen chosen?
Well, I mean, in the white church culture, we sit in the pews, we behave, we're quiet, we're not call and response, it's not participatory like it is in an evangelical, white evangelical expression. So that's something to consider, just to contextualize. But my question is, in your piece about the timing and the method, it's basically something that I would call graceful engagement, which is a very persuasive strategy on a one-on-one basis. But in terms of application in a church setting, clergy aren't always able to have the luxury of that being the setting in which that occurs. Oftentimes you can, but sometimes your parishioners come in and they confront you with it. Mm-hmm. And in the process, as a matter of pastoral care, you may address their concerns, but then at the same time you're providing pastoral harm to others. So how would you bridge that divide?
Sure. Well, it's not a simple answer or a one-time thing, right? That you have to build relationship. And I really do mean it, that building relationship and maintaining relationship comes first. And a few of us were actually talking about this at dinner last night, that something I've believed from the first day I was working in parish life was that if you attend to spiritual care, if you're at the bedside, if you're at the grave, you're there for the baptism, you're there for the wedding, you're part of the family's life over time, and this also argues for staying in a congregation a lot longer than sometimes pastors now stay. You can get away with saying a lot of things from the pulpit that you can't if you're perceived as being only interested in making a political point or only interested in Sunday morning and you looking great, but you're not out there in and among the people. So I think that's key. And especially with the folks that maybe you don't like to hang out with, but making a point of getting around to see them. And then I really do believe in empathic listening as something that can change hearts and minds. That the example I always used in my pastoral care classes was as a way of our communicating with one another in class. Actually, I would set a covenant for us at the beginning of class, and one of the things we would say was try to exercise curiosity rather than complaint or judgment. So the minister comes in and the altar guild person is happily setting up American flags on the altar. And you might want to say some things about that. But maybe the first way in is not to say, get that thing off the altar right now. Or even, that does not belong here. Just, you know, in a flat-footed way. But what if you were saying, I see that you're putting, I know this sounds so hard to do and so hokey, but I see that you're putting an American flag on the altar. I wonder what that means to you today. But seriously, convey curiosity rather than immediately going in with judgment, and find out, well, it's because this Sunday my son who served in the war and died 5 years ago, this is the anniversary of his death, and I really wanted to honor him. Now you've got something to work with. And so, you know, say, well, you know, usually the altar isn't for what am I trying to say here? Patriotic symbols, yes, thank you. However, maybe we could have these flags somewhere, maybe at the coffee hour, where we could make a little, and I would be happy to make a little talk about him and have you come up and we could all experience something about what his life was about. Now, I don't know if she'll accept that or not, but that is a better way of trying to engage it than just being stentorian and saying, you know, off with the flags. Yes, Paul. Oh, I feel like I'm back home.
Thank you so much.
My dean is addressing me.
No, thank you so much. Many of the observations that you made are, you know, right on target. But as you're reflecting about it, if you could strike off the word Christian, the phenomena that you described is happening all over the world.
Yes, it is.
So my question is about the cross-cultural comparison. In India, there is a saffron revolution, Hindu nationalism. You have it in
Modi.
Modi. You have it in Burma, Sri Lanka, and many of the Muslim countries, and so forth. So it's not simply a peculiarly Christian phenomenon of ethno-nationalism or religious nationalism. Zeal for one's faith often leads to zealotry. How do we look at it in a global perspective? You know, it has happened in the past in many contexts, in Germany, you know, during the Hitler's regime.
Right.
So what lessons would you suggest in terms of a psychological understanding of this phenomena, worldwide phenomena?
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at that a lot, but I don't feel like it's my place in this book to address, you know, nationalisms in other places, except to note that there are many parallels in other places, and there are. And they tend to be now looking at each other, again, you know, the ability of people to communicate through social media and to compare myself as the dictator here with that person. Well, they have more gold thrones or they have more weapons and I want them too. And Trump very much has looked at some of these other leaders around the world to try to emulate and compete with. I think psychologically, well, two things. First of all, I think we have to distinguish between patriotism and nationalism. And that patriotism is love of country, full stop. And you can love the place that you were born and grew up in and have memories about, and your family grew up there, and that can be, it's tricky because it can edge over into nationalism, but it can be a positive force if it's in its place and it doesn't see patriotism as the primary value of life, that it's just a part of life. Whereas nationalism is actually ethnocentrism in most expressions of nationalism. It means that one ethnic group that identifies itself as the traditional people of that nation want to keep it that way, and they want their laws and their social life and their culture to remain consistent with that ethnic group. And so if you look at most of these movements around the world, the leaders are appealing to that nostalgia, to that sense of tradition. And if they can bring in religion to do it, all the better. You know, Trump didn't start out as a super faithful Christian person. He brandished a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church after clearing the street with horses against people who were protesting in a Black Lives Matter protest. And 2 Corinthians just doesn't quite sound right. But he tried to adopt the mantle of religiosity in order to intensify his appeal to a particular cultural group. So if culture in that particular nation involves a particular religious identity that has been dominant in a certain period of time, then they will either adopt it or fuse with it. So you see Putin making nice to the, and you see this in other religious traditions across the world as well. So the common denominator there is the strongman leader. And there's actually a very good book by, I think she's at the University of Pennsylvania, called Strongmen, where you can look at the comparisons of the different strongman leaders and their common characteristics. But basically, from a psychological point of view, you're talking about a narcissistic leader who is able to very cleverly use charisma and a certain kind of public rhetoric. They're very good at modulating their voices up and down and getting kind of to the point that was made about more active. If you look at a lot of large evangelical services, you're not seeing that much participation, actually. It's like a performance for an audience. They may wave their arms some, but they are not the performers. They are consumers. And so it's the charisma of the leader or the leader's team that creates a kind of a series of emotional highs and lows that are very, very seductive. And these, I mean, if you listen to Hitler's tapes, you mentioned Hitler, he absolutely mastered the art of public rhetoric. And one of the things I've noticed about Trump's speeches is that he can go into an almost hypnotic sounding, I mean, he sounds boring, or it sounds like he's bored, sort of monotone. And then he'll erupt into something else. But during that sort of hypnotic monotone, he's then, you know, he's getting people to listen and to pay more attention, and then he'll break that with some kind of a big statement. So these are tactics that they come naturally to some people who have a kind of they had to be charismatic as kids, maybe to get anything that they ever wanted, and they learned how to use it and exploit it for public purposes. There's no doubt in my mind that Trump himself had a severe emotional deficit as a child growing up in the household that he did, and that he's trying to be the big man, and by all those efforts to be the big man, he's actually trying to fill a big hole inside. But that is no excuse for the behavior. Right. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
I'd like to have you talk a little bit more about the mechanisms for progressive Christians and white nationalist Christians to talk. Example, here in Mount Airy, we live in a liberal bubble. How are we to get into dialogue with the other folks?
Well, there have been some efforts to actually create organizations to make that happen. The organization Braver Angels has tried to do that, and it has been fairly successful in some places. It kind of blew up in Gettysburg. I understand they're trying to reconstitute themselves. It's a tough thing to sustain, I think. And I'm not sure group work is always the best way to do that. There's also some work being done by individuals who've written books about hosting dinners with people who are deliberately chosen, who do not share all of the same ideologies. So going back to my days working with Salvadorian refugees and also in El Salvador, I will say the most powerful thing that really convicted people in those days was hearing testimonies of harm from Salvadorans who had come. And so somehow I think to evoke empathy by allowing people to hear what is the harm that's being caused by these ideologies. And I'm not sure how to set that up in a way that would be safe, you know, for people working in the battered women's movement too. We often would have survivors who would come and talk to groups. But I do think probably our liberal, so-called liberal churches are a place to start, because there are many people in the pews who are convinced of at least some of the Christian nationalist ideas, and that these are places where sometimes we like to just kind of cover things over in the big tent and everything's okay, but to have you know, like a Lenten forum where people can come together and actually have a facilitator who could help have honest dialogue that is not attacking one another, but really sharing from that place of help me understand you. I think we have actually, as mainline church people, we have a capacity and an obligation really to not have this conversation be silenced. And as leaders, we can find ways to facilitate those conversations that don't cause further hurt. Bill?
Yeah, Pam, are you hopeful that that the work that you're doing will begin to seep into the expressions of formation and almost what I would call catechesis in congregations? What are the next stages? You've mentioned, you and I have talked, and you've mentioned the three-part video series by the diocese in LA. Can you talk about how can we get better at engaging this in a broad and deep and lived level?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the earlier question too about how do we make a dent. I'm hopeful because if I weren't hopeful, I wouldn't be standing here. I don't know if I'm optimistic, or at least I don't know if I'm optimistic in the short term. I really mean what I said about this being a pivotal moment in American democracy and American Christianity. And I think it depends on those of us who tend to not want to engage in conflict so much to find another way to engage that doesn't have to mean conflict, but does mean honest dialogue with people where they're ready to do that. And the more we can kind of encourage our congregations to learn how to have those kinds of conversations, because a lot of people never were brought up to know how to have those conversations. Even starting with just basic, how do you have a conversation about something that's tough? Instead of just, you know, oh, we're all friends here, we can agree to disagree. How do you have those conversations? There are ways to do it, but people are not necessarily just automatically going to know how to do that. So I think that's a place where we can do these things. And yes, Susan Russell, who's a canon in the Diocese of LA, decided to create a 3-part study series for congregations based on the book, with a couple of videos and some ancillary readings that she recommends to congregations, and the diocese is doing it. So we'll find out. They're just beginning this, so we'll find out if it was effective at all. But I do think you've got to start with individuals at the grassroots and with the groups of people that you know. Lori?
So Susan Russell's pieces are related to your book.
Yeah.
And the ELCA has a draft social statement out right now, eager for feedback around government and civic engagement. So one low-hanging fruit might be for all of our congregations to look at that material, engage your book, and offer feedback on the social statement, which worries me because it seems a little bit nice and a little bit less of this. Your images make so clear this is of the utmost importance. We've got to deal with this. And I'm a bishop in Oregon, and so I can't say what it's like here. It's probably a lot better. But in Oregon, our muscles for this kind of difficult conversation are pretty flabby. We've got a lot of work to do. So that would be one low-hanging fruit for us to engage in, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for this book. Thank you.
Thank you. The other thing I just want to say back to Bill's question is, you know, am I hopeful? Am I optimistic? Why do I even do this? Partly because I can't convince certain people that I'm close to even. I can't convince them. And I'm not going to try to, you know, I said no argumentation, period. What do I do from a therapist point of view with my countertransference? What do I do with my feelings about what I couldn't accomplish with a person? And other than, you know, my assistant when I was dean used to say, kiss it up to God, which is good. But I think that activism for me and education is the way that when we really hit a wall and we can't go any further with a certain group or certain individuals, it doesn't mean that we have to throw in the towel. I think then you get yourself out there. You go to the next Black Lives Matter demonstration or go to City Hall. I have a slide. I didn't show it to you tonight because for sake of time, but these principles of conversation can also be used when thinking about going to a legislator's office or going, you know, run for school board. Oh my gosh, so many of the debates that center in this whole ball of wax are happening right now in school boards around the so-called critical race theory that most of them don't understand what it is. Or censorship of books and those sorts of things. And so we can be active at the local community level where actually a lot of the right-wing activism is taking place and infiltrating very local and county level and state level legislation. It doesn't all have to happen at the national level, and we can get involved with that. And another thing I do recommend in the book for discharging your frustration is write op-eds. Learn how to do it, and do it. Because maybe folks in the pews or in the community who are more conservative are not reading the New York Times, you know, that terrible fake news. But they're going to read the local paper because they're going to see where their grandkids got a trophy or the high school won a match, and they're going to want to know about the local news and what's going on. So they'll read that paper, and so they'll look at yours and they'll think, but they'll read it. And over time, you know, this has to be a long slog. We are not going to make these changes that we want to make instantaneously. It's not going to happen that way. And when you're up against a group of people who are seeing this as a millennial apocalyptic activity, they have all the time in the world, and they are super patient. This doesn't even go back 30 years it doesn't go back to the Reagan era. This goes back to some of the revivalisms that were earlier in American history. It goes all the way back. So these are very patient people who don't necessarily expect to see all the wins for them in their lifetime. we need to also take on that perspective that you're not going to be able to change everything tomorrow, like I thought when I was 22, you know. But together, I do believe we have more ability to make change in congregations and among the people that we serve than we are going to be able to do individually. So keep at it. That sounds like it might be a moment of closure. Thank you.
I don't know if we're supposed to say this has been delightful, because it is obviously one of the pressing crises of our time. But I would like to point out that Dr. Cooper-White not only talks the talk, but she walks the walk. Those pictures you saw of the Black Lives Matter protests with the counter-protesters and their guns, those were pictures she took while she was there on the square in Gettysburg in the summer of 2020. So
We were.
Yes, well, I'm not promoting my brand tonight. I'm promoting yours. But it is so wonderful to have such an advocate for this kind of work, and your wisdom and resilience. Thank you so much for what you've done.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
We do have a bit of a reception over in Law Lounge, and we do have a few copies of the book available, and I'm sure that Pam would be happy to sign them. We'll sell them for $15. If you didn't bring your checkbook or cash and you only have a credit card, we know where you live. So we will honor the system, and you'll be able to take care of that part later. So let's enjoy some time together and further the conversation over in Law Lounge, and the books are out here in the main hall. So thank you for being here tonight, and thank you to the over 70 people who are watching online. We are so grateful to all of you. Yeah.